Hey there, history lovers. If you're getting ready to drift off, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's travel back in time. Tonight's story begins with a young medieval woman, barely 16, screaming alone in a dark chamber while her husband paces helplessly outside, forbidden from entering. Imagine a world where giving birth meant being abandoned to face death with nothing but medieval superstitions, bizarre rituals, and the slim hope that an illiterate village woman might know which herbs wouldn't kill you. This is the real story of medieval childbirth, and it's far stranger, darker, and more desperate than anything you've imagined. When we think about medieval times, we usually picture knights and castles, plagues and peasants, but there's one aspect of medieval life that's been largely hidden from history books: the terrifying reality of what it meant to be a woman bringing life into this world. See, in medieval Europe, pregnancy wasn't just dangerous, it was essentially a death sentence that you might survive if you were incredibly lucky. Historians estimate that between 10 to 20% of women died in childbirth during the Middle Ages, and that's probably a conservative estimate because record-keeping was about as reliable as a chocolate teapot. But here's the truly mind-boggling part: they were expected to face this alone. Not alone as in without family support, but literally physically alone, because medieval society had created such bizarre and twisted rules around birth that women were essentially abandoned at their most vulnerable moment. Picture this. You're a medieval woman, and the moment your labor begins, every man in your life, your husband, your father, your brothers, even the village priest, suddenly becomes forbidden from helping you. They couldn't enter the room, they couldn't offer medical assistance, they couldn't even pray over you in most cases, because the Catholic Church had declared that childbirth was a fundamentally unclean and sinful process that would contaminate any man who witnessed it. The logic was absolutely insane. God had cursed women through Eve's sin, and therefore watching a woman give birth was like watching sin itself unfold, which would spiritually pollute any man who witnessed it. So there you are, dealing with what medieval people literally called the curse of Eve, completely cut off from half of your community, relying entirely on other women who, let's be honest, knew about as much about anatomy and medicine as a modern toddler knows about quantum physics. These women had learned everything they knew from other women who had learned from other women, in an endless chain of folk wisdom that occasionally stumbled onto something useful but more often than not was a collection of superstitions, old wives' tales, and practices that were actively harmful. And the truly insane part? This wasn't considered cruel or unusual. This was considered proper, moral, and absolutely necessary for the spiritual health of society. Medieval people genuinely believed that if a man witnessed childbirth, he would be spiritually corrupted and need weeks of purification rituals to clean his soul. They thought that the very act of seeing a woman give birth would make a man unfit to receive communion, unfit to handle holy objects, and basically unfit to participate in civilized Christian society until he went through elaborate cleansing ceremonies involving holy water, confession, and sometimes even temporary exile from the community. The wealthy might have multiple women attending them during birth, but even these attendants were often just other noble ladies who had survived their own births and therefore were considered experienced, regardless of whether they actually knew anything useful. The poor, meanwhile, might have a single village woman who doubled as a midwife, herbalist, and probably the person who also helped slaughter pigs and deliver calves. These women operated in a world where the line between midwifery and witchcraft was razor thin, where knowing too much about herbs could get you burned at the stake, but knowing too little could get you blamed for every baby and mother who died under your care. So tonight we're going to explore how this absolutely bonkers system actually worked, why intelligent people thought this made perfect sense, and how women managed to survive and even thrive in what might be the most systematically abandoned situation in human history. We'll discover the secret networks of female knowledge that developed in the shadows, the bizarre medical practices that were considered cutting-edge treatment, and the incredible stories of women who faced impossible odds with nothing but determination and whatever folk wisdom they could gather. Trust me, by the end of this story you'll never complain about modern hospital policies again, and you'll have a whole new appreciation for just how remarkable it is that any of us are here today. To understand just how insane the medieval approach to childbirth was, we need to step into the shoes of a typical woman living in, say, 13th century England or France, and realize that her entire life was essentially structured around the assumption that pregnancy would probably kill her. This wasn't paranoia or pessimism. This was cold, hard mathematical reality that shaped every aspect of medieval society. For a medieval woman, marriage wasn't primarily about love or companionship. It was a reproductive contract with death as the most likely outcome. Most girls were married by age 16, sometimes as young as 12 if they were from noble families where political alliances needed to be secured quickly, and from the moment they said, "I do," the countdown to their first pregnancy began immediately because producing heirs wasn't just expected, it was literally the only reason society considered them valuable. The average medieval woman, if she survived to adulthood, could expect to be pregnant between 8 to 15 times during her reproductive years, and this is where the math becomes absolutely terrifying. With a 10 to 20% mortality rate per birth and an average of 10 pregnancies, most women were essentially playing Russian roulette over and over again until the chamber with the bullet finally came up. What's even more twisted is that medieval society was perfectly aware of these odds and had structured itself accordingly. Noble families would often arrange multiple marriages for their sons because they simply expected their wives to die young, and it was common for a man to bury 2 or 3 wives during his lifetime, not from plague or accident but from childbirth. The legal system even had specific provisions for this reality. Inheritance laws assumed that women would die before their husbands. Marriage contracts often included clauses about what would happen to property when the wife inevitably died in childbirth, and the Catholic Church had developed entire theological frameworks to explain why God wanted women to suffer and die this way. According to medieval Christian doctrine, women's pain in childbirth was literally God's punishment for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden, which meant that trying to reduce that pain was actually interfering with divine justice. This theological position had massive practical consequences. It meant that any attempt to develop better medical care for women during childbirth was considered not just unnecessary, but actually sinful and heretical. Why would you try to circumvent God's righteous punishment? This is why medieval medicine for childbirth focused more on spiritual preparation for death than on actually keeping women alive, and why the few women who did try to develop better birthing practices were often accused of witchcraft. The class differences in medieval childbirth were stark, but not in the way you might expect. Yes, noble women had better nutrition and more comfortable surroundings, but they also faced unique pressures that sometimes made their situations worse. A peasant woman who couldn't produce children might face hardship, but a noble woman who failed to produce male heirs could literally cause wars, lose her family's political power, and be divorced or murdered by her husband's family. Noble women were also more likely to be subjected to bizarre medical interventions by university-trained physicians who, despite being completely barred from actually attending births, would prescribe treatments from a distance based on ancient Greek and Roman texts that were laughably wrong about female anatomy. These learned men genuinely believed that women's wombs wandered around inside their bodies like lost animals, that pregnancy was caused by an excess of hot humors, and that the best treatment for difficult labor was bloodletting, which obviously made everything worse by weakening women who were already struggling to survive. Meanwhile, peasant women, despite having fewer resources, sometimes had better outcomes simply because they were more likely to be attended by village women who had actual hands-on experience rather than theoretical knowledge from books written by men who had never seen a birth. The economic impact of this system was staggering. Medieval society had to constantly account for the fact that roughly half of their adult women would die before age 30, which meant constant disruption of family structures, orphan children, and economic instability. Entire industries developed around this reality, from wet nurses who would feed babies whose mothers had died, to remarriage brokers who specialized in quickly finding new wives for widowed men, to religious orders that took in the endless stream of children who had lost their mothers in childbirth. What's truly remarkable is that despite knowing these odds, despite having mathematical proof that pregnancy was essentially a death sentence, medieval society never seriously considered that maybe, just maybe, they should try to change the system that was killing half their women. Now, if you think the basic setup of medieval childbirth was insane, wait until you hear about the absolutely bonkers collection of superstitions, folk beliefs, and pseudo-medical practices that surrounded pregnancy and birth in medieval Europe, because medieval people had managed to create a whole universe of bizarre theories about reproduction that would make modern conspiracy theorists look like rational scientists. First off, medieval people genuinely believed that a baby's appearance and personality could be permanently altered by what the mother looked at, thought about, or experienced during pregnancy, which led to the most ridiculous pregnancy advice in human history. Pregnant women were warned not to look at disabled people because their baby might be born with the same disability, not to think about ugly things because their baby would be ugly, and definitely not to look at animals during conception because the baby might be born with animal characteristics. This wasn't just old wives' tales. This was considered serious medical advice endorsed by university-trained physicians and church authorities. They called it maternal impression theory, and it was so widely believed that noble families would literally hire beautiful servants to stand around pregnant noble women so the babies would be born attractive, while ugly or disabled people could be banned from entire villages during pregnancy seasons. But the superstitions got even weirder when it came to determining the baby's gender. because medieval people were absolutely obsessed with having boys and had developed the most ridiculous methods for trying to guarantee male offspring. They believed that boys were conceived when the father was more passionate during sex, that sleeping on the right side during pregnancy would produce a boy while sleeping on the left would produce a girl, and that eating hot foods like meat and spices would create boys while cold foods like vegetables would create girls. Some medical texts seriously recommended that couples have sex during thunderstorms if they wanted boys, because the masculine energy of lightning would supposedly influence conception, while others suggested that women who wanted sons should eat the testicles of roosters or hang a sword over their bed during pregnancy. The church had its own set of completely insane beliefs about pregnancy and birth, many of which contradicted basic observation but were considered absolute truth because they came from religious authorities. Medieval Christians believed that babies didn't have souls until the moment of birth, which meant that anything that happened to the fetus didn't really matter spiritually, but they also believed that babies could be born already damned to hell if their mothers had sinful thoughts during pregnancy. They thought that difficult labors were signs that either the mother or baby was particularly sinful, that easy births meant the mother was especially blessed by God, and that babies who died during birth were being called directly to heaven as tiny martyrs. This created an impossible psychological burden for medieval women. If your labor was difficult, it meant you or your baby were evil, but if it was too easy, people might suspect you of witchcraft because only supernatural intervention could make childbirth painless. The folk remedies and medical treatments for pregnancy complications were a bizarre mixture of ancient pagan traditions, garbled biblical references, and complete nonsense that had somehow gotten passed down through generations of well-meaning but completely ignorant village women. Pregnant women were advised to wear amulets made from eagle stones, which were supposedly rocks found in eagle nests that would prevent miscarriage, but since actual eagle stones were rare, most women ended up wearing random rocks that merchants claimed were magical. They believed that tying red coral around a pregnant woman's waist would ensure an easy birth, that drinking wine mixed with powdered unicorn horn would prevent complications. Spoiler alert, it was usually just powdered narwhal tusk or horse bone, and that placing a lodestone under the birthing bed would somehow attract the baby out of the womb through magnetic force. When it came to actual medical intervention during difficult births, medieval practitioners had developed a horrifying arsenal of treatments that were often worse than doing nothing at all. They would perform bloodletting on women during active labor, believing that removing excess blood would make room for the baby to emerge, completely ignoring the fact that this often killed women who were already losing blood. They would force laboring women to drink concoctions made from ground-up animal parts, heavy metals, and toxic plants, believing that these would either speed up labor or provide mystical protection, when in reality they were often poisoning women who desperately needed hydration and nutrition. Perhaps most bizarrely, they had developed elaborate rituals around measuring and manipulating the birthing room that were supposed to influence the cosmic forces affecting childbirth. They would arrange furniture in specific patterns, burn particular combinations of herbs, recite prayers in certain sequences, and even time contractions according to astrological charts, as if the position of Jupiter could somehow make a breached baby turn around. Now, let me tell you about a real case that perfectly illustrates just how absolutely insane this system was, because in 1247, in a castle in northern France, a young noblewoman named Marguerite de Courtenay experienced what might be the most documented case of medieval childbirth abandonment that we have on record, and her story is so bizarre that it reads like a dark comedy written by someone who wanted to satirize medieval society but couldn't come up with anything more ridiculous than what actually happened. Marguerite was 19 years old, married to a minor lord named Guillaume de Montfort, and pregnant with what everyone desperately hoped would be a male heir to secure a rather shaky political alliance between two French noble families. When her labor began in the middle of winter, during a massive snowstorm that had essentially cut off the castle from the outside world, she found herself in the absolutely perfect storm of medieval birthing horror. Her husband Guillaume, following proper medieval protocol, immediately evacuated himself from anywhere near the birthing chamber and took refuge in the castle's great hall with his male relatives and knights, where they proceeded to get spectacularly drunk while praying loudly for a male heir, because apparently that was considered helpful. The castle's chaplain refused to enter the birthing area because he claimed it would contaminate his ability to perform mass. The village midwife couldn't reach the castle because of the snowstorm, and the only women present were a handful of female servants who had exactly zero experience with childbirth because most of them were either too young or too old to have been through it themselves. So there's Marguerite in active labor in a freezing stone chamber, attended by a nervous cook, two teenage maids, and an elderly woman whose primary qualification was that she had once helped birth a calf. But here's where the story gets really insane. according to the detailed records kept by the castle scribe, who was documenting everything for legal purposes in case inheritance issues arose. These well-meaning but completely clueless attendants decided to follow every single superstitious birthing practice they had ever heard of, simultaneously, because they figured that if one magical remedy was good, 20 magical remedies would be 20 times better. They filled the room with burning herbs that were supposed to ward off evil spirits but actually just created a choking smoke that made breathing difficult. They arranged iron objects in mystical patterns around the bed because iron was supposed to protect against demonic interference. They made Marguerite drink a concoction that included ground-up pearls, wine, and what they claimed was powdered unicorn horn but was probably just crushed bone from the kitchen scraps. They hung religious relics from every available surface, including a piece of cloth that they swore had touched the Virgin Mary's birthing gown. They placed lodestones under the mattress to magnetically attract the baby, and they kept rearranging the furniture every few minutes according to different folk traditions they remembered, turning the birthing chamber into a constantly shifting maze of superstitious objects and choking herbal smoke. Meanwhile, Marguerite was experiencing a prolonged and difficult labor that went on for nearly 36 hours, during which time her husband and his companions continued their vigil in the Great Hall, getting progressively more drunk and more convinced that the length of the labor meant either the baby was especially blessed by God or especially cursed by the devil, but definitely not that maybe someone should check on the woman who was actually doing all the work. The male servants were forbidden from entering the women's area of the castle, so food and water had to be passed through a complicated relay system that involved leaving supplies outside the chamber door and retreating before the women inside could retrieve them, because even indirect contact with the birthing process was considered spiritually dangerous for men. At one point, when Marguerite's screams became so intense that they could be heard throughout the castle, Guillaume actually sent word asking if maybe they should summon a priest to perform last rites, not because he was concerned about his wife's suffering, but because he was worried that if she died without proper spiritual preparation, it might affect the baby's claim to inherit property. The scribe's records note that the women attending Marguerite were becoming increasingly desperate and had started arguing about which superstitious practices to follow, with some insisting that the iron objects were actually hindering the birth and should be removed, while others were convinced that moving them would invite demonic possession, leading to a surreal situation where a woman in active labor was surrounded by attendants having theological debates about the proper mystical arrangement of household objects while she was literally fighting for her life. What's absolutely mind-blowing about Marguerite's situation is that everyone involved considered this complete abandonment to be not just normal, but actually the most moral and proper way to handle childbirth. Her husband, the castle servants, the local villagers who heard about it later, all of them thought this was perfectly fine. Their reactions reveal just how deeply medieval society had internalized the idea that women's suffering during birth was not only inevitable but actually spiritually beneficial for everyone involved. When word of Marguerite's prolonged labor spread through the village below the castle, the local peasants didn't react with horror or offers to help. Instead, they organized prayer circles. They began making bets on whether the length of the labor meant the baby would be especially holy or especially cursed. Medieval people genuinely believed that difficult births were cosmic events that reflected the spiritual state of the entire community. The village priest, Father Henri, actually praised Guillaume for his restraint in staying away from the birthing chamber. He declared from the pulpit that Guillaume's resistance to the temptation to comfort his wife was a sign of his strong Christian character. He said it showed Guillaume understood that women's pain in childbirth was God's will that should not be interfered with by masculine weakness or sentiment. The other noble families in the region heard about the situation. They sent messages of congratulation to Guillaume. Congratulation for handling the birth properly, according to Christian doctrine. Several lords wrote letters praising him for maintaining the spiritual purity of his household, for ensuring that no men were contaminated by witnessing the unclean process of birth. The medieval church had created such a comprehensive theological framework around women's isolation during childbirth that people genuinely believed Guillaume's absence was spiritually necessary, not just socially appropriate, actually necessary for the salvation of everyone involved. The local bishop heard about the 36-hour labor. He declared it a sign that God was testing the spiritual strength of the entire castle community. He ordered special masses to be said. Masses thanking God for giving Guillaume the wisdom to stay away from his wife during her time of trial. Apparently divine wisdom in medieval times meant abandoning your spouse when they needed you most. The reaction of other women in the community is equally revealing. Instead of being outraged that Marguerite had been left with inexperienced attendants, the local noblewomen praised the castle's female servants. They praised them for their dedication in staying with her despite the spiritual danger. Medieval people believed that attending a birth was spiritually risky for women too, just less risky than it would be for men. These women genuinely thought that Marguerite's attendants were performing an act of Christian charity. Charity by risking their own spiritual purity to help her. They organized special prayers asking God to forgive the attendants for any spiritual contamination they might have acquired by witnessing the birth process. The broader community reaction was equally twisted. When news spread that Marguerite had finally given birth to a healthy son after 36 hours of labor, people didn't celebrate her survival. They didn't acknowledge her incredible endurance. Instead, they praised God for blessing Guillaume with an heir despite his wife's obvious spiritual deficiencies. The length and difficulty of the labor was interpreted as evidence that Marguerite had been harboring sinful thoughts during pregnancy. The village women organized a purification ceremony for Marguerite that would last 40 days after the birth. During this time she would be considered too spiritually unclean to enter the church, too unclean to handle food that men would eat, too unclean to participate in any religious activities. Medieval Christianity taught that giving birth made women temporarily as spiritually contaminated as lepers. Perhaps most bizarrely, when the story of Marguerite's difficult birth spread to other noble families, it actually enhanced Guillaume's reputation as a pious and morally upright lord. His refusal to break church protocol by comforting his wife during labor was seen as evidence of his commitment to Christian values over worldly emotion. Other lords began inviting Guillaume to serve as a godfather for their children. They asked his advice on moral matters. A man who could resist the temptation to interfere with God's punishment of women was obviously a person of exceptional spiritual strength. Now, while Marguerite was fighting for her life in that freezing stone chamber, the story takes an even more twisted turn when the official church authorities decided to get involved. Not to help, mind you, but to make absolutely sure that proper spiritual protocols were being followed. Because apparently what a woman in 36 hours of labor really needed was a theological inspection. The Bishop of Reims, who had jurisdiction over the region, heard about the prolonged birth and immediately dispatched his personal representative, a priest named Father Augustine, to ensure that the castle was handling the situation according to official church doctrine. Father Augustine arrived at the castle on the second day of Marguerite's labor. He didn't go anywhere near the birthing chamber, obviously. Instead, he set up what he called a spiritual oversight station in the castle's chapel. From there, he began issuing detailed instructions about how the birth should be managed. Not medical instructions, spiritual instructions. He declared that the difficulty of Marguerite's labor was clearly a sign that either she or the baby had been touched by demonic influence. This meant that special exorcism prayers needed to be recited every hour. He also determined that the birthing chamber needed to be spiritually cleansed with holy water sprinkled around the doorframe. But not inside the room, because that would require a man to enter the contaminated space. The holy water had to be thrown from the hallway, like they were trying to bless a room full of plague victims. Father Augustine also brought with him a collection of official church documents outlining the proper spiritual procedures for difficult births. These documents, written by learned theologians who had obviously never witnessed an actual birth, contain the most bizarre mixture of religious theory and complete medical nonsense you can imagine. They specified that if a labor lasted more than 24 hours, it was evidence of spiritual warfare between good and evil forces for control of the baby's soul. Therefore, additional prayers were required. If the labor lasted more than 36 hours, as Marguerite's was doing, it meant that Satan himself was trying to claim the child. This required escalated spiritual intervention, including the reading of specific biblical passages, the burning of particular combinations of blessed herbs, and the arrangement of consecrated objects in mystical patterns around the castle. The church authorities were also deeply concerned about the spiritual contamination that was spreading throughout the castle due to the prolonged birth. They declared that any man who had heard Marguerite's screams was now spiritually impure and would need to undergo purification rituals. Any woman who had been in the same building as the birth was considered contaminated and would be banned from church services until she had been properly cleansed. Even the castle's food supply was declared suspect, because the female servants attending the birth had been handling both the birthing materials and the kitchen duties. Father Augustine ordered that all food prepared during the birth needed to be thrown away. The cooking vessels needed to be blessed before they could be used again. The entire kitchen needed to be spiritually cleansed with a complex ritual involving holy oil, blessed salt, and prayers in Latin that nobody except Father Augustine actually understood. But the most insane part of the church's intervention was their concern about the legal and spiritual status of the baby if it was born during this extended spiritual crisis. According to church doctrine, babies born during spiritually contaminated circumstances might not be eligible for proper Christian baptism. This could affect their inheritance rights, their legal status as legitimate heirs, even their ability to enter heaven if they died young. So Father Augustine began preparing alternative baptismal procedures that would need to be performed immediately after birth to counteract any demonic influence that might have affected the child during the prolonged labor. These procedures involved multiple priests, special holy water that had been blessed specifically for spiritually compromised births, and a complex ritual that would need to be performed before the baby could be considered a proper Christian. The church authorities also demanded detailed documentation of everything that had happened during the birth, not for medical purposes, but to create an official record that could be used to determine the spiritual status of the child and the level of contamination that had affected the castle's inhabitants. They wanted to know exactly which prayers had been said, which holy objects had been present, which superstitious practices the female attendants had used. All of this information would be evaluated by church scholars to determine what additional purification rituals would be required. Meanwhile, Guillaume and his male companions had been joined in the Great Hall by Father Augustine and several other priests. They spent their time conducting elaborate prayer sessions, reading from theological texts about the spiritual significance of difficult births, and debating whether the length of Marguerite's labor was a sign that God was testing their faith or that the devil was trying to steal their heir. As Marguerite entered her second full day of labor, the attending women decided that the situation was so desperate that they needed to escalate from folk remedies to what they considered serious medical intervention. And this is where our story transitions from merely insane to absolutely horrifying. Because medieval medical science for childbirth was essentially a collection of treatments designed by people who seemed to be actively trying to kill women while maintaining plausible deniability. The lead attendant, an older servant named Agnes who had appointed herself as the chief medical authority despite having no actual training, declared that Marguerite's prolonged labor was obviously caused by corrupted blood that needed to be released before it poisoned both mother and child. So she sent word to the castle's barber surgeon, a man whose primary qualifications were that he could cut hair and had once successfully removed an arrow from a knight's shoulder. The barber surgeon, following the medical wisdom of the time, determined that bloodletting was absolutely essential. Not just a little bloodletting, extensive bloodletting. Because medieval medical theory taught that women's bodies contained excessive amounts of hot, corrupted humors that needed to be drained to make room for the baby to emerge. Think about this logic for a moment. A woman who has been in labor for 36 hours, who is already exhausted and dehydrated, who desperately needs every ounce of strength and blood volume she can maintain, and the medical solution is to deliberately weaken her further by draining her blood. The barber surgeon set up his equipment just outside the birthing chamber, because even medical procedures couldn't override the prohibition against men entering the contaminated space. So he had to give instructions to Agnes about where to make the cuts, how deep to go, how much blood to collect. Agnes, who had never performed bloodletting in her life, was essentially performing medieval surgery by proxy, with shouted instructions through a door. On a woman in active labor. They made cuts on Marguerite's arms, her legs, even her neck, because different blood sources were supposed to treat different types of spiritual and physical corruption. The neck blood was for spiritual purification. The arm blood was for physical strengthening. The leg blood was for removing obstacles to birth. This wasn't medicine. This was ritualized torture with a medical excuse. But the bloodletting was just the beginning of the medical horrors they inflicted on poor Marguerite. When the bloodletting didn't immediately resolve the labor, Agnes decided that the problem must be demonic possession. This required what medieval medicine called spiritual purging, which meant forcing Marguerite to drink increasingly toxic concoctions designed to drive out evil spirits. They started with a mixture of wine, ground pearls, and what they claimed was holy water. Then they escalated to more exotic ingredients, powdered bones from saints' relics, ground up gems that were supposed to have protective properties, herbs that were actually poisonous but were believed to have spiritual cleansing effects. Each concoction was more dangerous than the last, and each one was administered to a woman who was already severely dehydrated and weakened from blood loss. The most horrifying part is that these treatments were being prescribed by Father Augustine, who was consulting official church medical texts, Texts written by learned theologians who combined ancient Greek medical theories with Christian spiritual beliefs to create the most deadly healthcare system in human history. According to these texts, if spiritual purging didn't work, the next step was physical exorcism. This involved burning specific combinations of herbs around the laboring woman to create smoke that would drive out demons, touching her with blessed objects that were supposed to repel evil spirits, and reciting prayers in Latin while physically manipulating her body in ways that were supposed to force the demons to release their hold on the birth process. Picture this scene. A woman who has been in labor for almost 2 days, who has been bled extensively, who has been forced to drink poisonous concoctions, who is now being surrounded by choking herbal smoke, while people chant in a language she doesn't understand, while pressing religious objects against her body, all while she's trying to give birth. Medieval medical theory also taught that if none of these treatments worked, the problem might be that the baby was positioned incorrectly due to supernatural interference. The solution was to use blessed objects to try to magically reposition the child from outside the womb. They would place lodestones on Marguerite's belly and move them in specific patterns, believing that the magnetic properties would somehow attract the baby into the correct position. They would press holy relics against different parts of her abdomen while reciting prayers, thinking that divine power would compel the baby to turn. They even tried what they called sympathetic magic, where they would manipulate dolls or carved figures in the ways they wanted the baby to move, believing that this would somehow influence the real child inside the womb. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn that medieval authorities never saw coming. Because while the church and male-dominated medical establishment were busy creating this elaborate system of abandonment and spiritual torture, something completely unexpected was happening in the shadows. The systematic exclusion of men from childbirth had accidentally created the most extensive underground network of female knowledge and mutual aid in medieval Europe. Women who were forced to handle births alone had started developing their own medical practices, their own support systems, their own ways of sharing information that completely bypassed male authority. And in many cases, these female networks were actually more effective than official medicine. Think about it this way. While university-trained male physicians were consulting ancient Greek texts and prescribing bloodletting from a distance, the women who were actually present during births were learning through direct observation and experience. They were seeing what actually worked, what made things worse, what helped women survive. And most importantly, they were sharing this knowledge with each other through secret channels that the male authorities knew nothing about. Agnes, the servant who had been torturing Marguerite with medieval medical procedures, was actually part of a network of women that stretched across several villages and included everyone from peasant midwives to noble ladies. These women had developed a sophisticated communication system for sharing information about births. They used coded messages, secret meetings, even a primitive form of medical record-keeping that tracked which treatments actually helped women survive. When Agnes realized that the official medical treatments were killing Marguerite rather than helping her, she made a decision that could have gotten her executed for witchcraft. She secretly sent word to a woman named Marie Le Sage, who lived 3 villages away. Marie was what we might call a professional midwife today. But in medieval terms, she was dangerously close to being a witch. Marie had attended hundreds of births. She had developed techniques for helping babies that were positioned incorrectly. She knew which herbs actually helped with pain and which ones were poisonous. She had even figured out basic sanitation practices that reduced infection rates. But most importantly, she had trained a network of other women who could assist her. Women who shared knowledge and supported each other despite the massive legal and spiritual risks involved. When Marie received Agnes's secret message, she immediately set out for the castle. But she couldn't just show up and announce herself, because unofficial midwives operated in a legal gray area where helping too many women survive could get you accused of supernatural interference with God's will. So Marie had to infiltrate the castle disguised as a servant bringing supplies from a neighboring estate. Once inside, she had to communicate with Agnes using hand signals and coded phrases to avoid detection by Father Augustine and the other male authorities. What happened next reveals just how sophisticated these underground female networks had become. Marie quickly assessed that Marguerite was suffering from dehydration, blood loss, and poisoning from the various medical treatments she had received. But she couldn't openly contradict the official medical procedures without risking accusation of witchcraft. So she had to work within the existing system while secretly implementing actual medical care. She convinced Agnes to tell Father Augustine that they needed to perform a spiritual cleansing ritual that required privacy and silence. This gave them cover to stop the bloodletting and toxic treatments. Under the guise of preparing holy water for spiritual purification, Marie was actually giving Marguerite clean water and simple herbal teas that would help with hydration and pain management. She told Agnes to announce that the exorcism prayers required complete silence. This stopped the constant chanting and allowed Marguerite to rest between contractions. Most brilliantly, Marie claimed that she had received a divine vision, instructing her to position blessed objects around Marguerite's body in a specific pattern. What she was actually doing was using gentle massage and positioning techniques to help the baby move into a better position for delivery. The other women in the network had developed an entire vocabulary of religious-sounding explanations for effective medical practices. This allowed them to provide real healthcare while maintaining the appearance of spiritual compliance. They called pain-relieving herbs blessed plants for spiritual comfort. They described proper sanitation as purification rituals to prevent demonic contamination. They referred to positioning techniques as arrangements pleasing to God and the saints. This wasn't just clever wordplay. This was a sophisticated resistance movement that was literally saving women's lives while operating under the noses of authorities who would have killed them if they had understood what was really happening. These women had figured out how to practice evidence-based medicine in a society that considered female knowledge to be inherently suspicious and potentially diabolical. They had created a parallel healthcare system that was more effective than the official medical establishment. And they had done it all while maintaining complete secrecy and plausible deniability. Just when you think this story couldn't get any more bizarre, something happened that sent the entire castle into complete spiritual panic and revealed just how deep the rabbit hole of medieval superstition actually went. Because at the exact moment that Marie Lesage began her secret medical intervention, a series of coincidences occurred that medieval people interpreted as clear evidence of supernatural warfare. And their reaction to these coincidences created a situation so absurd that it sounds like something from a comedy sketch. About 20 minutes after Marie had started her disguised medical care, the castle's rooster began crowing continuously. Not the normal dawn crowing. Continuous, frantic crowing that went on for hours. In medieval superstition, this was considered a sign that demons were being driven out of a location, which should have been good news. But the timing made everyone panic because they thought it meant the demons possessing Marguerite were becoming more powerful and were calling for reinforcements. At the same time, several of the castle's dogs began howling in unison. The milk in the kitchen soured despite the cold weather. A kitchen pot fell off a shelf for no apparent reason. And most ominously, a flock of ravens landed on the castle's roof and refused to leave. Father Augustine declared this combination of events to be clear evidence that they were witnessing the largest demonic assault on a Christian household that had been recorded in the region's history. But here's the really insane part. None of these events were actually supernatural. The rooster was crowing because he had been disturbed by all the unusual activity and noise around the castle. The dogs were howling because they could sense the stress and tension of the humans around them. The milk soured because the kitchen servants had been too distracted to properly tend to food storage. The pot fell because the castle's floors were uneven stone that shifted with temperature changes. And the ravens landed because castles often had food scraps and refuse that attracted scavengers. But medieval people had such an elaborate framework for interpreting coincidences as supernatural events that they transformed this perfectly normal series of minor incidents into evidence of cosmic spiritual warfare. Father Augustine immediately escalated the situation by declaring that the castle was under siege by a legion of demons, who were trying to claim both Marguerite and her unborn child for Satan. This meant that emergency spiritual protocols needed to be activated. Every man in the castle was required to begin continuous prayer rotations. Every woman was required to undergo immediate purification rituals. The entire food supply was declared contaminated and needed to be destroyed and replaced. Most importantly, Father Augustine decided that Marie Lesage's presence was suspicious. He had noticed that the supernatural events had begun shortly after her arrival. He started asking pointed questions about why a servant from a distant estate had chosen to arrive during such a spiritually dangerous time. What he didn't realize was that Marie had actually triggered most of this supernatural events through perfectly normal means. Her medical interventions had caused Marguerite to become calmer and quieter, which reduced the overall stress level in the castle, which affected the animal's behavior. Her insistence on cleaning and organizing the birthing area had led servants to discover spoiled food and unstable equipment that had been neglected during the crisis. Her presence had simply brought some practical order to a chaotic situation. But in medieval thinking, any change in circumstances during a spiritual crisis was evidence of supernatural intervention. Father Augustine began conducting what he called diagnostic prayers, to determine whether Marie was a blessed agent sent by God to help with the exorcism, or a demonic agent sent by Satan to make the situation worse. These diagnostic prayers involved asking Marie detailed questions about her religious knowledge, her family background, her previous experience with difficult births, any unusual dreams or visions she might have had. The fact that Marie knew more about childbirth than most women was interpreted as evidence that she had either received divine knowledge, or had learned forbidden secrets from demonic sources. The fact that she had arrived at exactly the right moment to help was seen as evidence that supernatural forces had guided her journey, either holy forces sending assistance, or evil forces sending a spy. Meanwhile, the other women in the castle were watching this interrogation with growing panic, because they realized that if Marie was accused of witchcraft, anyone who had associated with her could also be accused. Agnes was particularly terrified because she had been the one who sent the secret message asking for Marie's help. If Father Augustine discovered the underground network of female medical knowledge, it wouldn't just be Marie who faced execution. It would be dozens of women across multiple villages who had been secretly sharing life-saving information. The women began using their coded communication system to coordinate their stories. They needed to make Marie's presence seem like a coincidence. Her knowledge seemed like common female wisdom rather than specialized training. Her effectiveness seemed like divine blessing rather than practical skill. They essentially had to gaslight Father Augustine into believing that what he was witnessing was miraculous intervention rather than competent healthcare. While Father Augustine was conducting his spiritual investigation, the women in the castle were facing an impossible moral dilemma that perfectly captures the insanity of medieval society. Because they had witnessed firsthand that Marie's forbidden medical knowledge was actually saving Marguerite's life. But acknowledging this publicly would mean admitting that the official church-approved medical treatments had been slowly killing her, which could get them all executed for heresy. Agnes was caught in the worst position of all. She had seen Marguerite's condition improve dramatically once Marie stopped the bloodletting and started providing actual medical care. But she was also the one who had initially followed Father Augustine's instructions to implement the official treatments. If she now admitted that the church-approved medicine had been harmful, she would be confessing to nearly killing a noble woman through incompetence. If she defended the official treatments, she would be watching Marguerite die from a treatable condition. And if she supported Marie's methods, she would be admitting to practicing witchcraft. The younger servant women were experiencing their own crisis of faith. They had been raised to believe that the church's medical knowledge was divinely inspired and therefore infallible. But they were watching a woman who had been trained outside the official system demonstrate medical skills that were obviously superior to anything the church authorities could provide. This was forcing them to choose between their religious beliefs and the evidence of their own eyes. Some of them were beginning to whisper among themselves, wondering if maybe the church was wrong about women's knowledge being inherently evil. Wondering if maybe the male authorities didn't actually understand women's bodies as well as they claimed to. Wondering if maybe the underground network of female healers had been right all along to preserve and share medical knowledge despite the legal risks. But these doubts were terrifying, because questioning church authority on medical matters was just a short step away from questioning church authority on spiritual matters, which was heresy, which was punishable by death. Meanwhile, Marguerite herself was experiencing the most complex internal conflict of all. She could feel that her condition had improved significantly since Marie had arrived. Her pain was more manageable. Her strength was returning. The baby seemed to be moving into a better position. But she had been raised to believe that easy births were signs of spiritual corruption. That women who didn't suffer enough during childbirth were probably receiving demonic assistance. She was caught between gratitude for the relief she was experiencing and terror that this relief meant she was being corrupted by evil forces. Every time her pain decreased, she wondered if she was damning her soul by accepting help that might be supernatural. Every time she felt stronger, she worried that she was allowing demons to give her unnatural strength. She was literally afraid that surviving childbirth might cost her eternal salvation. At the same time, the male authorities were having their own internal conflicts. Father Augustine was becoming increasingly suspicious that something unusual was happening, but he couldn't quite identify what it was. The supernatural signs had appeared to indicate demonic activity, but Marguerite's condition was improving, which should mean that their spiritual interventions were working. But the improvement had started when Marie arrived, which suggested either that Marie was a blessed healer sent by God, or that she was a demonic agent whose presence had somehow triggered the spiritual cleansing. Guillaume was experiencing his own moral crisis. He could hear that his wife's screams had become less frequent and less intense, which should have been a relief. But he had been taught that women's pain during childbirth was God's will. Was he supposed to be happy that his wife was suffering less? Did that make him a bad Christian? Was he supposed to pray for her pain to return so that God's justice could be properly served? Or was he supposed to be grateful that the spiritual interventions were apparently working? The other priests who had arrived with Father Augustine were debating among themselves about the proper interpretation of the situation. Some argued that the improvement in Marguerite's condition proved that their prayers and spiritual treatments were effective. Others worried that the improvement was too rapid and might indicate supernatural interference. They were essentially arguing about whether a woman's survival was evidence of divine blessing or demonic corruption. Which tells you everything you need to know about medieval priorities. The castle's male servants and knights were facing their own dilemma. They had been excluded from the birthing area for spiritual reasons. But they could see that something important was happening. Something that might affect the inheritance of their lord's estate. They felt responsible for protecting the castle and its inhabitants. But they had been told that their presence would actually make the situation more dangerous. They were experiencing the frustration of being made powerless in their own home by religious rules that didn't make practical sense. As the conflicts within the castle reached a breaking point, Father Augustine decided that the situation required the most drastic spiritual intervention available to medieval Christianity. An intervention so elaborate and ridiculous that it would have been rejected as too absurd for a medieval comedy. But this was real life in 1247. And medieval authorities had convinced themselves that desperate times called for measures that were somehow even more desperate. Father Augustine announced that he was going to perform what the church called a great exorcism of childbirth. This was apparently a real procedure, documented in official church manuals, designed for cases where demonic forces were believed to be interfering with the natural process of birth. The procedure required the participation of multiple priests, dozens of blessed objects, and a collection of holy relics that would need to be borrowed from churches across the region. But here's where it gets really insane. The great exorcism of childbirth couldn't be performed in the same building as the actual birth, because the spiritual contamination from the birthing process would interfere with the holy power of the exorcism. So Father Augustine decided that they needed to construct a separate blessed space, outside the castle, where they could perform the exorcism ritual while maintaining spiritual purity. They began building what they called a purification pavilion in the castle's courtyard. This involved creating an elaborate tent-like structure, decorated with religious symbols, filled with burning incense, and surrounded by a complex arrangement of holy objects that had been borrowed from every church within a day's travel. The pavilion was designed according to specific theological instructions about the proper spatial relationships between different types of blessed objects. The crucifix had to be positioned exactly 12 feet from the altar. The holy water had to be arranged in a specific pattern that corresponded to biblical numerology. The religious relics had to be displayed in order of their spiritual significance, creating what was essentially a holy obstacle course in the middle of the castle's courtyard. Meanwhile, inside the castle, the exorcism procedure required the women attending Marguerite to follow an equally elaborate set of spiritual protocols. Every hour, Agnes had to sprinkle holy water in a clockwise pattern around the birthing chamber. Every 2 hours, the women had to recite specific prayers while holding blessed candles. Every 3 hours, they had to rearrange the religious objects in the room according to a rotating schedule that corresponded to different saints' feast days. The logistics of coordinating this spiritual choreography while also attending to a woman in active labor created absolute chaos. Agnes was constantly checking a handwritten schedule that Father Augustine had created, trying to remember which prayers went with which hourly observances, while also monitoring Marguerite's condition, while also communicating with Marie using their secret coded signals, while also maintaining the appearance of spiritual compliance. But the most ridiculous part of the great exorcism of childbirth was the sympathetic spiritual warfare that Father Augustine had designed to combat what he believed were the demonic forces affecting the birth. This involved Guillaume and the other men performing elaborate mock battles in the purification pavilion, while the priests chanted Latin prayers. They would engage in choreographed sword fights that were supposed to represent the spiritual battle between good and evil for control of the unborn child's soul. Guillaume would play the role of the Archangel Michael, fighting against other men who were playing the roles of various demons, while Father Augustine narrated the battle using biblical quotations, and other priests provided dramatic sound effects by banging on drums and ringing bells. This wasn't intended as theater or entertainment. This was considered serious medical intervention. Medieval authorities genuinely believed that performing this symbolic warfare would somehow influence the spiritual forces affecting Marguerite's labor. The knights and male servants were required to participate in these mock battles for hours at a time, while wearing improvised costumes that were supposed to represent angels and demons, while following complex choreographed movements that Father Augustine had designed based on his interpretation of biblical descriptions of heavenly warfare. The whole thing was so elaborate that they had to assign scribes to document every aspect of the ritual, so that church authorities could later analyze which elements of the exorcism had been most effective. These scribes were frantically taking notes, recording the exact time each prayer was recited, the precise movements of each mock battle, the specific positioning of each holy object, creating what was probably the most detailed documentation of organized medieval insanity that has ever survived. Meanwhile, Marie was watching this entire circus while secretly continuing to provide actual medical care to Marguerite. She had to time her real treatments to coincide with the hourly spiritual observances, so that her evidence-based medicine would be disguised as compliance with the exorcism protocols. She was essentially practicing modern obstetrics while participating in a medieval fantasy role-playing game that everyone else thought was deadly serious. But just when you think this story has reached peak medieval absurdity, something happened that is so completely insane that I had to double-check the historical records multiple times because it sounds like something a satirist would invent to mock medieval society. But this actually happened, and it's documented in multiple independent sources. Because while Guillaume was outside in the courtyard playing dress-up angel warrior, while Father Augustine was conducting his elaborate spiritual theater, while Marie was secretly practicing actual medicine disguised as religious compliance, the neighboring lord, a man named Robert de Montclair, decided that this situation presented a perfect opportunity to solve a completely unrelated political problem. Robert had been feuding with Guillaume for months over a property dispute involving some farmland along their shared border. Nothing to do with childbirth. Nothing to do with spiritual warfare. Just a typical medieval pissing contest between minor nobles who couldn't agree on where their territories ended. But Robert looked at this whole exorcism circus and had what he apparently considered a brilliant idea. He would use Guillaume's spiritual crisis to force a resolution to their property dispute. Because obviously the best time to engage in political extortion is when your neighbor's wife is dying in childbirth. Robert showed up at the castle gates with a small army of his own knights and servants. He announced that he had received a divine vision, instructing him to assist with the great spiritual battle that was taking place. He claimed that God had revealed to him that the demonic forces affecting Marguerite's childbirth were actually originating from the disputed farmland, because Guillaume had been illegally occupying territory that rightfully belonged to Robert. The demons were apparently upset about this property violation and were taking revenge by interfering with Guillaume's heir production. Now, any rational person would have told Robert to go away and come back when there wasn't a medical emergency happening. But this was medieval Europe, and the idea that property disputes could have supernatural consequences was considered perfectly plausible. Father Augustine was immediately fascinated by this theory, because it provided a clear explanation for why the demonic assault on the castle had been so unusually strong. It wasn't just random evil. It was targeted supernatural justice against Guillaume's property crimes. Robert proposed a solution that was so transparently self-serving that it should have been laughable. Guillaume needed to immediately sign over the disputed farmland to Robert, along with a formal apology for the spiritual contamination his illegal occupation had caused. In exchange, Robert would contribute his knights to the mock spiritual battles in the Purification Pavilion, adding extra warrior angels to help combat the demons. He would also provide additional holy relics from his own family's collection, including what he claimed was a piece of wood from Noah's Ark. That would surely help with the exorcism process. If Guillaume refused this generous offer, Robert warned that he would be forced to conclude that Guillaume was deliberately maintaining his alliance with the demonic forces, which would make Robert morally obligated to report Guillaume to church authorities as a heretic, who was using witchcraft to threaten his neighbor's spiritual welfare. This was essentially medieval extortion wrapped in religious language. But Guillaume was in no position to negotiate. His wife was dying. He was surrounded by priests who were convinced that supernatural forces were at work. He had just spent 2 days participating in elaborate spiritual theater that had apparently failed to resolve the crisis. And now he was being told that his property crimes might be responsible for everything that had gone wrong. The most insane part is that Guillaume actually agreed to Robert's demands, right there in the courtyard, while his wife was in labor upstairs. while grown men in costumes were still performing choreographed sword fights against imaginary demons. Guillaume signed legal documents transferring valuable farmland to his neighbor, because he had been convinced that real estate transactions might have mystical obstetric benefits. Robert immediately declared that he could already feel the spiritual atmosphere improving now that the property violation had been corrected. He ordered his knights to join the mock battles with extra enthusiasm, because the demons would now be weakened by the restoration of proper land ownership. Father Augustine praised this development as evidence of divine guidance bringing justice and healing through unexpected channels. Even Marie, who was secretly watching this entire circus while continuing to provide actual medical care, was apparently so stunned by the sheer audacity of Robert's extortion scheme that she later described it in her private notes as the most shameless exploitation of human suffering she had ever witnessed. And she lived in medieval Europe, where shameless exploitation was basically a national sport. But here's the truly unbelievable part. When word of this incident spread to other noble families in the region, Robert's extortion scheme was praised as a brilliant example of Christian problem-solving. Other lords began looking for opportunities to resolve their own property disputes by claiming supernatural connections to their neighbors' medical emergencies. It apparently became a trend. Medieval nobles started showing up at each other's family crises with claims that their feuds were causing spiritual contamination that required immediate legal resolution. Now, what makes this whole bizarre situation even more historically significant is that Marguerite's case was happening at exactly the same time as a much larger conflict that was tearing apart medieval Europe's approach to medical knowledge. And this conflict helps explain why the authorities reacted so extremely to what should have been a straightforward medical emergency. Because 1247 wasn't just a random year in medieval history. It was right in the middle of what historians call the Great Medical Revolution of the 13th century, when the Catholic Church was desperately trying to maintain control over all medical knowledge while universities were beginning to challenge traditional approaches to healthcare. Just 2 years earlier, in 1245, Pope Innocent IV had issued a papal bull specifically targeting what he called the dangerous spread of unauthorized medical knowledge among women. This wasn't just about childbirth. This was about the Church's growing panic that traditional folk medicine, which was primarily practiced and transmitted by women, was becoming more trusted and effective than official church-approved treatments. The Pope had declared that any woman who practiced medicine without official church authorization was presumptively guilty of witchcraft, because obviously the only way women could know anything about healing was through demonic assistance. At the same time, the newly established medical schools at universities like Paris, Bologna, and Montpellier were producing male physicians who had never actually touched a patient but were considered more qualified than women who had decades of hands-on experience. These university-trained doctors were required to base all their treatments on ancient Greek and Roman texts, even when those texts were obviously wrong about basic anatomy. They were forbidden from learning from empirical observation or from female practitioners who actually knew what they were doing. This created the insane situation where legal medical practice was becoming less effective while illegal medical practice was becoming more sophisticated. Marie Le Sage and her network of female healers were part of a continent-wide underground movement of women who were secretly developing evidence-based medical practices while official medicine was becoming increasingly divorced from reality. The church authorities were terrified of this movement because it represented women claiming authority over knowledge that was supposed to be controlled by male institutions. Father Augustine's extreme reaction to Marie's presence wasn't just about spiritual purity. It was about defending the Church's monopoly on medical authority against a growing network of women who were proving that official medicine was often worse than useless. What's really fascinating is that this same conflict was playing out simultaneously in dozens of locations across Europe. In 1247, a midwife named Isabella de Foix was being tried for witchcraft in southern France for successfully treating difficult births using techniques that were more effective than official medical procedures. In England, a woman named Margaret the Healer was being investigated by church authorities for operating what was essentially an underground medical school that taught other women practical surgical techniques. In the Germanic territories, entire villages were being accused of harboring medical heretics, because their women were successfully treating conditions that university-trained physicians couldn't handle. The church was so threatened by this female medical knowledge that they had begun what was essentially a continent-wide campaign of medical suppression disguised as spiritual protection. They were systematically destroying centuries of accumulated medical knowledge that had been preserved and developed by women, replacing it with theoretical treatments that were often deadly but were considered spiritually pure because they came from male authorities. Marguerite's case was happening right at the center of this larger historical struggle. Marie's secret intervention represented everything that the church was trying to destroy: evidence-based medicine, female authority over women's bodies, practical knowledge that challenged theoretical doctrine, networks of women sharing information outside official control. When Father Augustine conducted his investigation of Marie, he wasn't just trying to determine whether she was practicing witchcraft. He was participating in a broader institutional effort to eliminate alternative medical traditions that threatened church authority. The fact that Marie's techniques were obviously more effective than the official treatments only made her more dangerous from the church's perspective. Because if women could successfully challenge medical doctrine, what would stop them from challenging religious doctrine? The property extortion scheme that Robert de Montclair had pulled during the crisis was also part of this larger pattern. Medieval nobles had learned that they could exploit the church's paranoia about unauthorized medical knowledge to manipulate legal and political situations. By claiming supernatural connections between their feuds and their neighbors' medical emergencies, they could force resolution of disputes that had nothing to do with healthcare. This was becoming such a common tactic that some historians argue it contributed to the destabilization of medieval property law. Just when it seemed like the situation at the castle couldn't possibly become more insane, everything came to a head in what might be the single most bizarre medical emergency in recorded history. Because at the exact moment when Marguerite finally entered the final stage of labor, Father Augustine's investigation reached its peak. Robert de Montclair's property extortion was escalating, and Marie's underground network was on the verge of being completely exposed. All while a crowd of grown men in improvised angel costumes were performing choreographed sword fights in the courtyard. And somehow, this combination of events triggered what Father Augustine would later describe as the greatest manifestation of supernatural warfare ever witnessed in Christian Europe. Around dawn on the third day, Marguerite's labor suddenly intensified dramatically. Thanks to Marie's secret medical intervention, the baby had moved into the correct position and was finally ready to be born. But to the medieval observers who didn't understand what was actually happening, this sudden change looked like a massive escalation in the spiritual battle they thought they were fighting. Agnes burst out of the birthing chamber, screaming that Marguerite was being possessed by the spirit of birth itself, and that supernatural forces were taking control of her body. Father Augustine interpreted this as evidence that his great exorcism was working too well, that they had successfully driven the demons out of the baby, but now those demons were making a final desperate assault on the mother. He immediately ordered all the men in the courtyard to escalate their mock battles to maximum spiritual intensity, which meant that Guillaume and Robert's knights began literally attacking each other with real swords while shouting Latin prayers. Because apparently the best way to help a woman give birth was to start an actual armed conflict in the courtyard below her window. But the real crisis began when one of the village women who was part of Marie's underground network made a catastrophic mistake. A woman named Clotilde, who had arrived earlier disguised as a servant, was so panicked by the chaos that she forgot to maintain her coded communication system. She ran up to Marie in full view of Father Augustine and started speaking openly about the techniques she had learned from the wise women of Brittany, and asking whether they should use the birthing positions that had worked in the difficult cases last year. Father Augustine heard every word. His investigation had finally uncovered the evidence he had been looking for. Proof that there was an organized network of women sharing unauthorized medical knowledge, practicing techniques that weren't approved by church doctrine, operating a parallel medical system that challenged official authority. He immediately declared that he had discovered not just a case of individual witchcraft, but evidence of what he called a conspiracy of medical heretics. Marie, Agnes, Clotilde, and potentially dozens of other women were part of an organized effort to undermine God's will by interfering with divine punishment. Father Augustine ordered his assistant priests to begin immediate arrest procedures. Agnes was to be bound and held for formal investigation. Clotilde was to be interrogated about the extent of the heretical network. Marie was to be examined for signs of demonic possession or supernatural knowledge. Any other women who had been in contact with them were to be isolated and questioned. But here's where the situation became absolutely surreal. At the exact moment that Father Augustine was ordering these arrests, Marguerite gave birth to a healthy baby boy, after 3 days of labor. Despite being subjected to bloodletting, toxic medications, spiritual torture, and complete abandonment by her husband, she had survived everything that medieval medicine could throw at her and successfully delivered the heir that everyone had been praying for. The timing created complete cognitive chaos among the medieval observers. Had the baby been born because the great exorcism had finally worked? Had the spiritual warfare in the courtyard driven away the demons at the crucial moment? Had the discovery of the heretical network somehow triggered divine intervention? Or had the heretical network been responsible for saving both mother and child through forbidden knowledge? Father Augustine was faced with an impossible interpretive dilemma. If he arrested the women who had attended the birth, he would be arresting the people who had apparently been present during a miraculous divine intervention. If he declared the birth a miracle, he would be validating the effectiveness of unauthorized medical practices. If he claimed that the Church's spiritual interventions had been responsible for the successful birth, he would have to explain why those interventions had failed for the first 2.5 days. Meanwhile, Guillaume was experiencing his own crisis of interpretation. He was holding his newborn son. His wife had survived against all odds. His inheritance was secure. But he was being told that the people who had helped save his family were dangerous heretics who needed to be arrested and possibly executed. He was caught between gratitude for his family's survival and loyalty to church authority that demanded he condemn the people who had made that survival possible. The news of what had happened at Guillaume's castle spread through the surrounding villages like wildfire, and the population's reaction revealed just how completely medieval society had lost any ability to think rationally about women's healthcare. Because instead of celebrating the successful birth or questioning why official medical treatment had nearly killed both mother and child, the local people became absolutely obsessed with determining which supernatural forces deserved credit for the survival. The village priest who had originally praised Guillaume for staying away from his wife now declared that Guillaume's spiritual strength had been the decisive factor in the successful birth. God had rewarded Guillaume's obedience to church doctrine by allowing the baby to survive despite his wife's obvious spiritual deficiencies. The fact that Marguerite had required 3 days of labor was proof that she had been harboring sinful thoughts. But Guillaume's faithfulness had eventually overcome her spiritual weakness through divine intervention. The local peasants organized celebration festivals that completely ignored Marguerite's experience and focused entirely on Guillaume's supposed spiritual victory. They sang songs praising his resistance to the temptation to comfort his wife. They told stories about how his pious behavior had convinced God to spare the baby despite the mother's unworthiness. They created folk tales that would be passed down for generations about the Lord who was so holy that he could save his heir through the power of prayer alone. Meanwhile, other villages interpreted the events completely differently and reached equally insane conclusions. Some communities decided that the successful birth proved that the great exorcism of childbirth was the most effective medical intervention ever developed. They began demanding that their own priests perform similar rituals for difficult births. Even when there was no evidence of spiritual complications. Even when the elaborate ceremonies were more dangerous than the original medical problems. Village women started requesting mock sword battles in their courtyards whenever they went into labor. Because apparently watching grown men fight imaginary demons was considered beneficial obstetric care. Robert de Montclair's property extortion scheme was also being celebrated as a brilliant innovation in medieval problem-solving. Other nobles heard about how he had successfully resolved a land dispute by claiming supernatural connections to his neighbor's medical emergency. And they immediately began looking for opportunities to copy his tactics. A lord in Normandy claimed that his neighbor's difficult harvest was causing spiritual contamination that was affecting his own family's health. A baron in Burgundy argued that a property boundary dispute was creating demonic interference with his wife's pregnancy. The idea that feudal conflicts could have mystical medical consequences became so popular that medieval courts actually began hearing legal cases based on these claims. But the most twisted part of the population's reaction was their response to the discovery of Marie's underground network of female healers. Instead of recognizing that these women had saved lives using superior medical knowledge, the communities became paranoid about unauthorized female expertise. Villages began conducting investigations to identify any women who might have secret medical knowledge. Church authorities organized what they called medical purity inspections, where village women were questioned about their knowledge of herbs, birthing techniques, and folk remedies. Any woman who knew too much about healing was automatically suspected of witchcraft. Any woman who had successfully helped other women through medical crises was investigated for possible demonic assistance. The result was that communities began systematically destroying their own healthcare resources out of paranoia about supernatural contamination. Women who had been serving as village healers for decades were forced to stop practicing. Folk medical knowledge that had been accumulated over generations was suppressed. Traditional remedies that had actually been effective were abandoned in favor of church-approved treatments that were often useless or harmful. Some villages became so obsessed with medical purity that they banned women from sharing any health-related information with each other. Pregnant women were forbidden from discussing their experiences with other women. Mothers were prevented from teaching their daughters about childbirth and infant care. The communities were essentially sabotaging their own survival in order to maintain ideological compliance with church doctrine about female knowledge. Perhaps most bizarrely, the regional church authorities decided that Guillaume's case should be used as a model for how similar situations should be handled in the future. They created official protocols based on the chaos at his castle. Protocols that required elaborate spiritual procedures for difficult births. Protocols that mandated the exclusion of experienced female attendants in favor of theoretical male oversight. Protocols that turned every medical emergency into a religious crisis requiring intervention by multiple priests and complex ceremonial procedures. These protocols were distributed to churches across the region as examples of best practices in spiritual healthcare. The fact that the official treatments had nearly killed both mother and child was completely ignored. The fact that unauthorized female knowledge had actually saved lives was treated as evidence of dangerous spiritual contamination that needed to be prevented in the future. Medieval authorities had looked at a situation where their system had failed catastrophically, and their response was to make that system even more rigid and even more divorced from medical reality. The news of what had happened at Guillaume's castle spread through the surrounding villages like wildfire, and the population's reaction revealed just how completely medieval society had lost any ability to think rationally about women's healthcare. Because instead of celebrating the successful birth or questioning why official medical treatment had nearly killed both mother and child, the local people became absolutely obsessed with determining which supernatural forces deserved credit for the survival. The village priest who had originally praised Guillaume for staying away from his wife now declared that Guillaume's spiritual strength had been the decisive factor in the successful birth. God had rewarded Guillaume's obedience to church doctrine by allowing the baby to survive despite his wife's obvious spiritual deficiencies. The fact that Marguerite had required 3 days of labor was proof that she had been harboring sinful thoughts. But Guillaume's faithfulness had eventually overcome her spiritual weakness through divine intervention. The local peasants organized celebration festivals that completely ignored Marguerite's experience and focused entirely on Guillaume's supposed spiritual victory. They sang songs praising his resistance to the temptation to comfort his wife. They told stories about how his pious behavior had convinced God to spare the baby despite the mother's unworthiness. They created folk tales that would be passed down for generations about the Lord who was so holy that he could save his heir through the power of prayer alone. Meanwhile, other villages interpreted the events completely differently and reached equally insane conclusions. Some communities decided that the successful birth proved that the great exorcism of childbirth was the most effective medical intervention ever developed. They began demanding that their own priests perform similar rituals for difficult births. Even when there was no evidence of spiritual complications. Even when the elaborate ceremonies were more dangerous than the original medical problems. Village women started requesting mock sword battles in their courtyards whenever they went into labor. Because apparently watching grown men fight imaginary demons was considered beneficial obstetric care. Robert de Montclair's property extortion scheme was also being celebrated as a brilliant innovation in medieval problem-solving. Other nobles heard about how he had successfully resolved a land dispute by claiming supernatural connections to his neighbor's medical emergency, and they immediately began looking for opportunities to copy his tactics. A lord in Normandy claimed that his neighbor's difficult harvest was causing spiritual contamination that was affecting his own family's health. A baron in Burgundy argued that a property boundary dispute was creating demonic interference with his wife's pregnancy. The idea that feudal conflicts could have mystical medical consequences became so popular that medieval courts actually began hearing legal cases based on these claims. But the most twisted part of the population's reaction was their response to the discovery of Marie's underground network of female healers. Instead of recognizing that these women had saved lives using superior medical knowledge, the communities became paranoid about unauthorized female expertise. Villages began conducting investigations to identify any women who might have secret medical knowledge. Church authorities organized what they called medical purity inspections, where village women were questioned about their knowledge of herbs, birthing techniques, and folk remedies. Any woman who knew too much about healing was automatically suspected of witchcraft. Any woman who had successfully helped other women through medical crises was investigated for possible demonic assistance. The result was that communities began systematically destroying their own healthcare resources out of paranoia about supernatural contamination. Women who had been serving as village healers for decades were forced to stop practicing. Folk medical knowledge that had been accumulated over generations was suppressed. Traditional remedies that had actually been effective were abandoned in favor of church-approved treatments that were often useless or harmful. Some villages became so obsessed with medical purity that they banned women from sharing any health-related information with each other. Pregnant women were forbidden from discussing their experiences with other women. Mothers were prevented from teaching their daughters about childbirth and infant care. The communities were essentially sabotaging their own survival in order to maintain ideological compliance with church doctrine about female knowledge. Perhaps most bizarrely, the regional church authorities decided that Guillaume's case should be used as a model for how similar situations should be handled in the future. They created official protocols based on the chaos at his castle. Protocols that required elaborate spiritual procedures for difficult births. Protocols that mandated the exclusion of experienced female attendants in favor of theoretical male oversight. Protocols that turned every medical emergency into a religious crisis requiring intervention by multiple priests and complex ceremonial procedures. These protocols were distributed to churches across the region as examples of best practices in spiritual healthcare. The fact that the official treatments had nearly killed both mother and child was completely ignored. The fact that unauthorized female knowledge had actually saved lives was treated as evidence of dangerous spiritual contamination that needed to be prevented in the future. Medieval authorities had looked at a situation where their system had failed catastrophically, and their response was to make that system even more rigid and even more divorced from medical reality. Now, you might think that this absolutely insane story from 1247 was just an isolated incident of medieval stupidity that would eventually be forgotten as society became more rational. But you would be completely wrong. Because the protocols and superstitions that emerged from Marguerite's case actually became institutionalized across medieval Europe and persisted for centuries, creating a legacy of systematized medical abandonment that makes modern healthcare debates look like minor disagreements about paperwork. The church authorities were so impressed with the spiritual success of Guillaume's case that they began requiring similar procedures for all difficult births involving noble families. By 1250, just 3 years later, the great exorcism of childbirth had become standard protocol for any labor that lasted more than 24 hours. Churches across France, England, and the Germanic territories began maintaining permanent collections of the blessed objects and ceremonial equipment needed for these elaborate spiritual interventions. Priests were given special training in the choreographed mock battles that were supposed to combat demonic interference with births. The Catholic Church actually created an official manual for conducting spiritual obstetric warfare, complete with detailed instructions for the proper positioning of holy relics, specific prayers for different types of birthing complications, and precise choreography for the sword-fighting ceremonies that were supposed to drive away demons. This manual was distributed to hundreds of churches and was used for more than 2 centuries as the definitive guide to Christian childbirth management. But the most insane part of this legacy was how the underground network of female medical knowledge responded to the increased persecution. Instead of giving up or going completely underground, these women became incredibly sophisticated at disguising evidence-based medicine as religious compliance. They developed an entire vocabulary of Christian-sounding terminology for effective medical practices. They created fake religious ceremonies that were actually practical healthcare interventions. They learned to time their real medical treatments to coincide with official spiritual observances so that their competent care would be interpreted as miraculous religious intervention. Marie Le Sage's techniques for secretly practicing obstetrics during exorcism ceremonies became so sophisticated that they were passed down through generations of female healers like a medieval medical school curriculum. These women created coded instruction manuals disguised as prayer books. They developed training programs disguised as religious retreats. They established communication networks disguised as pilgrimages and religious festivals. By the early 14th century, there were essentially 2 parallel medical systems operating in medieval Europe. The official system, run by male church authorities and university-trained physicians who had never actually attended a birth. And the underground system, run by networks of women who had developed increasingly sophisticated evidence-based medical practices while maintaining perfect cover as devout Christians following church protocols. The property extortion schemes that Robert de Montclair had pioneered also became a permanent feature of medieval legal culture. Noble families learned that they could manipulate any medical emergency to extract political concessions from their neighbors by claiming supernatural connections between feuds and healthcare crises. Medieval courts began hearing dozens of cases every year where lords argued that their property disputes were causing mystical interference with their neighbors' family health. Some regions actually passed laws recognizing spiritual contamination through feudal conflict as a legitimate legal concept. This meant that if your neighbor's wife had a difficult pregnancy, you could be legally required to resolve any property disputes you had with her husband. Because apparently medieval people believed that real estate disagreements could cause obstetric complications through magical means. Perhaps most remarkably, the systematic exclusion of men from childbirth that had started as a religious purity requirement eventually evolved into the most comprehensive female-controlled healthcare system in human history before the modern era. By the 15th century, childbirth had become so completely dominated by women's secret medical networks that male authorities had essentially lost all practical control over obstetric care. They maintained theoretical authority and continued to prescribe treatments from a distance. But the actual medical interventions were being provided by highly trained female specialists who had developed techniques that were often superior to anything available through official channels. These women had created Europe's first evidence-based medical education system, the first systematic approach to clinical observation and documentation, the first networks for sharing medical innovations across geographic boundaries, all while operating under the legal fiction that they were simply following religious protocols established by male authorities. The irony is absolutely perfect. The Church's attempt to control women's medical knowledge by forcing them to operate in secret had accidentally created the conditions for women to develop the most advanced medical system in medieval Europe. The systematic abandonment of women during childbirth had forced them to become more medically sophisticated than their male counterparts. The prohibition against female medical authority had resulted in women developing more effective medical practices than officially recognized male physicians. So what's the moral of this absolutely bonkers medieval story? Well, there are actually several morals. And they're all pretty relevant to modern life in ways that might make you uncomfortable. First, if you ever find yourself in a system where the people making the rules have never actually done the work they're regulating, you should probably be suspicious. Medieval physicians who prescribed childbirth treatments had never attended a birth. Modern politicians who regulate industries they've never worked in. Medieval priests who designed medical protocols had never touched a patient. Modern administrators who create healthcare policies without clinical experience. The pattern is remarkably consistent across centuries. People who have never done something are surprisingly confident about how it should be done. And they're usually wrong in predictable ways. Second, when authorities tell you that excluding practical expertise will improve outcomes, they're probably trying to protect their own authority rather than solve actual problems. Medieval church leaders claimed that banning experienced female healers would lead to better spiritual and medical results. What they actually meant was that including experienced female healers would threaten their control over medical knowledge. Modern institutions that exclude practical expertise while claiming it's for quality or safety reasons. Well, same energy, different century. Third, underground networks of people sharing practical knowledge are usually more effective than official systems that prioritize compliance over results. Medieval women developed superior medical techniques by sharing information outside official channels. Modern professionals in highly regulated industries often develop better practices through informal networks than through official training programs. When the official system is more concerned with maintaining authority than achieving results, the unofficial system tends to become more competent. Fourth, the most elaborate and expensive interventions are often less effective than simple, practical approaches implemented by people who actually understand the problem. Medieval authorities spent enormous resources on spiritual theater that made birth outcomes worse. While simple techniques like proper hydration and positioning, implemented by experienced women, actually saved lives. Modern healthcare has some interesting parallels in terms of expensive, complex interventions versus basic preventive care implemented by people who understand practical health management. But perhaps the most important moral is about what happens when society systematically undervalues the knowledge and experience of people who are actually doing the work. Medieval women were forced to develop sophisticated medical practices in secret because their knowledge was considered inherently suspicious. Modern frontline workers in various industries often develop expertise that's ignored by management because it doesn't fit official theories about how things should work. The people who are actually handling the day-to-day reality of complex problems often know more about effective solutions than the people who are theoretically in charge. And when you create systems that ignore or suppress that practical knowledge, you get worse outcomes for everyone. Except the people whose authority depends on maintaining the fiction that theoretical knowledge is superior to practical experience. The really funny part is that medieval authorities spent so much energy trying to prevent women from developing unauthorized medical expertise that they accidentally created the most comprehensive medical education system for women in European history. Modern institutions that try to tightly control knowledge and expertise often have similar unintended consequences. People find ways to learn and share information anyway. And the underground systems they create are often more effective than the official systems that are trying to suppress them. Because people who are actually solving problems tend to focus on what works, while people who are protecting institutional authority tend to focus on what looks impressive and maintains their control. So if you're ever in a situation where the official experts seem more concerned with maintaining their authority than with achieving good results, where practical expertise is being excluded in favor of theoretical compliance, where elaborate procedures are being prioritized over simple effectiveness, where the people doing the actual work are being ignored by the people making the rules, well, you might want to look around for the unofficial networks of people who actually know what they're doing, because those networks probably exist. They're probably more competent than the official system, and they're probably achieving better results while maintaining the polite fiction that they're following official protocols. Just like medieval women did for centuries. Some things never change. And that's probably both reassuring and terrifying depending on your perspective. The more things change, the more they stay exactly the same. Medieval people thought they were living in the most advanced, rational, spiritually enlightened society in human history. They would probably be very surprised to learn that we think their medical system was completely insane. Which raises the question of what future people will think about our current systems. But that's probably a topic for another video. Now, if you think the story of medieval childbirth was insane, wait until you hear what I discovered about how medieval people tried to cure the Black Death. Because apparently, when faced with a pandemic that was killing 1/3 of Europe's population, medieval authorities looked at their track record of spectacularly failing to help women survive childbirth and thought, you know what? Let's apply these same brilliant medical principles to plague treatment. And the result was a collection of treatments so absurdly deadly that the plague itself was probably less dangerous than the official attempts to cure it. Picture this. It's 1348, the Black Death has just arrived in Europe, and people are dying by the thousands every day in major cities. The same church authorities who thought that bloodletting laboring women and excluding practical medical knowledge was good healthcare policy now had to figure out how to treat a disease that was completely unlike anything they had ever encountered. Their solution? Double down on everything that hadn't worked for any other medical condition they had tried to treat. They decided that the plague was obviously caused by sinful thoughts creating spiritual contamination in the air, which meant that the cure involved elaborate purification rituals, mass public confessions, and something called penitential bloodletting, where entire communities would gather in public squares to be bled simultaneously while reciting prayers. Because apparently the best way to help people who were already dying from infection was to weaken them further while creating large crowds of sick people in confined spaces. But that was just the beginning of medieval plague treatment. University-trained physicians, who had learned everything they knew from ancient Greek texts that had never mentioned plague, confidently prescribed treatments based on the theory that the disease was caused by corrupted air that had become too warm and humid. Their solution was to rebalance the air by burning enormous quantities of aromatic woods and herbs, which created so much smoke that many plague sufferers actually suffocated before the disease could kill them. They also recommended that people protect themselves from corrupted air by carrying around bags of sweet-smelling substances, which led to the bizarre sight of medieval Europeans walking around during a pandemic wearing what were essentially primitive gas masks made of flowers and spices. Meanwhile, the same underground networks of female healers who had been secretly practicing effective obstetric care turned their attention to plague treatment and began developing approaches that were actually based on observation and experience rather than ancient theories about air corruption. But because their medical knowledge was still considered inherently suspicious, they had to disguise their evidence-based plague treatments as compliance with official spiritual protocols. The result was a bizarre parallel medical system where women were secretly providing effective plague care while maintaining the appearance of following church-approved treatments that were actively making the pandemic worse. And the really insane part? When some communities that followed the underground female medical networks had significantly lower death rates than communities that strictly followed official church medical protocols, the authorities didn't conclude that maybe the women knew what they were doing. Instead, they concluded that the communities with lower death rates must be harboring witches who were using supernatural powers to protect themselves from God's righteous punishment. Which led to witch trials being conducted in the middle of a pandemic. Because apparently medieval people thought that the appropriate response to some communities being less affected by plague was to torture and execute the women who were actually helping people survive. But the absolute peak of medieval plague medicine was something called the Great Purification of London, which was probably the most elaborately counterproductive public health intervention in human history, and involves a story so ridiculous that it makes the Great Exorcism of Childbirth look like a model of rational healthcare policy. There are dancing plague victims, a bishop who thought he could cure infection through choreographed religious ceremonies, an entire city government that became convinced that the solution to pandemic disease was synchronized public singing, and a group of women who managed to save hundreds of lives while convincing the authorities that they were conducting elaborate prayer rituals. It's basically the medieval equivalent of trying to cure a pandemic through TikTok dances, except that some of the dances were actually effective medical treatments disguised as religious compliance. And the whole thing was documented in excruciating detail by multiple scribes who were apparently completely unaware that they were recording one of the most absurd public health disasters in human history. So if you want to hear about how medieval people managed to make a deadly pandemic even deadlier through the power of confident ignorance and institutional stubbornness, while accidentally discovering some treatments that actually worked, make sure you're subscribed because that story is coming up next. And that brings us to the end of our journey into the absolutely bonkers world of medieval childbirth, where women were systematically abandoned during their most vulnerable moments, where spiritual theater was considered more important than actual medical care, where underground networks of female healers secretly developed the most advanced healthcare system in Europe while pretending to follow protocols designed by people who had never attended a birth, where property disputes could apparently cause obstetric complications through magical means, and where survival depended more on your ability to disguise evidence-based medicine as religious compliance than on actually receiving competent medical treatment. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into what might be the most elaborately dysfunctional healthcare system in human history, and I hope it's given you some perspective on modern medical debates, because apparently, the tension between practical expertise and institutional authority, between evidence-based treatment and ideologically pure compliance, between the people who actually do the work and the people who make the rules about the work. These are not new problems. Medieval people were dealing with the same basic conflicts we face today. They just had more elaborate costumes and more creative explanations for why excluding competent people would somehow improve outcomes. But here's what I find most fascinating about Marguerite's story and all the other medieval women who survived this insane system. They didn't just endure systematic abandonment and medical negligence. They created something better. They built networks of knowledge and support that were more effective than the official systems that were supposed to be helping them. They developed techniques and treatments that were centuries ahead of their time. They figured out how to practice evidence-based medicine while maintaining perfect cover as devout religious women following church protocols. They turned their systematic exclusion from official medical authority into an opportunity to develop superior medical knowledge. And they did all of this while facing the constant threat of being accused of witchcraft if they were too effective. They knew too much. If they helped too many people survive situations that official medicine couldn't handle. That takes incredible courage, intelligence, and determination. And it's probably why any of us are here today. Because our ancestors survived medieval healthcare not because the official system worked, but because women figured out how to work around it. So the next time you're dealing with a system that seems more concerned with maintaining authority than achieving good results, the next time you encounter officials who are more worried about compliance than effectiveness, the next time you see practical expertise being excluded in favor of theoretical credentials, remember the medieval women who developed sophisticated medical practices while pretending to follow protocols designed by people who had never done the work they were regulating. Remember that competent people have always found ways to get things done, even when the official system is actively working against competence. And remember that the most important knowledge is often being developed and shared through unofficial networks by the people who are actually solving problems on a day-to-day basis. Now, I want to hear from you in the comments. What other medieval practices do you think would shock modern people? Have you ever encountered modern systems that remind you of medieval approaches to expertise and authority? Are there other historical examples of underground networks developing better solutions than official institutions? And what other bizarre historical medical practices would you like me to investigate? Because trust me, medieval medicine was full of treatments that make the great exorcism of childbirth look rational by comparison. If you enjoyed this deep dive into medieval insanity, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because I've got dozens more stories about how our ancestors managed to survive systems that seem specifically designed to make survival as difficult as possible. And if you want to see more content about the hidden networks of knowledge that have always existed alongside official institutions, let me know in the comments what historical periods or topics you'd like me to explore. Also, if you know anyone who might enjoy learning about how medieval people turned childbirth into elaborate spiritual theater while women secretly developed evidence-based obstetric care, please share this video with them. Because apparently, the more things change, the more they stay exactly the same. And it's probably important for people to understand that the conflicts we face between practical expertise and institutional authority are not new. They're just wearing different costumes. Thanks for joining me on this journey into medieval medical madness. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore how medieval people managed to make a deadly pandemic even deadlier through the power of confident ignorance and institutional stubbornness. And trust me, that story makes this one look like a documentary about rational healthcare policy. Until then, remember that competent people have always found ways to help each other, even when the official system is actively working against them. And that's probably the most important lesson we can learn from medieval history. Or any other period of history for that matter.